My husband is a huge football fan, and he told me this story about some football player who invested in a chain of fancy laundromats. Like while you're waiting for your laundry, you could get nice food. You sat in a massage chair, and there were like big screen TVs to watch while you were waiting for your laundry. And he lost a ton of money because he figured out that if you had enough money for a fancy laundromat, odds are you just owned your own washer and dryer. So, in summary, there's no market for a fancy laundromat. And that reminded me of this that I just made, because I just spent, I don't know, maybe like 8 hours making a fancy kids game. I don't think that there's a market for this. I made 3 of them, so hopefully at least 3 people in this world want it. But I did record, and so if you're interested in also overbuilding something that you won't get your time or money back on, you can follow along and see how I made this tumbling wooden block tower. I thought that one thing I could make would be a wooden tumbling block game. And I thought it would be kind of pretty if I did it in like different woods. And so what I did is I just took a whole bunch of scraps that I had and I ran them through the planer till they're the same thickness. And then I cut them to about 1 inch wide. So I have all these pieces here, and I'm about to use my small parts cross-cut jig to cut these things to about 4 inches long. So you might be wondering why I even started this project. As a woodworker, I focus mainly on building custom furniture, and there's a few reasons for this, but one of the big ones is that I find it really hard to be profitable on smaller items. To date, the project that I most underbid was a jewelry box that I made. Its overall size was probably only a cubic foot, but it took me longer to complete than any of my furniture pieces. It had 2 doors, 6 drawers, watch pillows, custom trays for rings, bracelets, and earrings. It had hangers for necklaces, and the whole thing was lined in leather. The lesson that I learned from that is that smaller doesn't mean easier. That piece had as many parts as a dresser, and because everything was so small, I had to do way more handwork than I would on a full-size dresser. So since I don't normally make smaller items, I don't usually do farmer markets or pop-ups. But this year, a friend asked me to host a table at her holiday market, and I thought it might be fun and a good way to get my name out in the community, so I said yes. I'm also at a loss as to what to make. I couldn't really think of anything, so I started with the staple, which is cutting boards. And while I was working on those cutting boards, some of my offcuts kind of reminded me of a game that I played as a kid, Jenga. And I thought, oh, this will be something simple I could take. But as it turns out, it wasn't nearly as fast as I thought it would be, and I spent way more time on it than I had planned. So while the build in this video might not be something that you're going to want to replicate, I'm going to focus on the process, because the key to profitability on smaller goods is having a good process. You have to be able to work efficiently, and you have to find ways of working small parts in larger batches. And like most things in life, the key to success is planning. And in this project, I totally skipped that. I jumped right into the project and I just started milling up the scraps that I could find with no idea how many blocks this would produce. I also didn't really think through the requirements of the game, and so I missed a key point. Okay, so this is what happens when I have no plan. I got maybe a third of the way through cutting, and I decided to start stacking them just to kind of get a sense of like what I had. And the length does matter. It should be proportionate to these. So you need 3 across, and so you need the bricks to be as long as 3 of them, because it needs to be a square when you stack them. Wait, is it supposed to be 4? I don't know. I think it's 3. Oh my God. So it is 3. So with that being said, I am going to just use my bricks as a way of setting my stop. All right, so I'm going to recut these a little shorter, and then
finish cutting the rest of that.
So the second part of being profitable on smaller items is batch work. I'm convinced there is no way you can make a profit building one small item. The only way to make it worth your while is to make at least a handful of them and try to make your profits in volume. So my goal for this project was to make at least a few of these. I really didn't have a clear idea of how many I could make, but it ended up being 3. Another essential part of being profitable on small projects is learning to overcome small, repetitive problems that, when compounded, end up costing you a bunch of time. When I was cutting these blocks to length, I needed a faster way to clear the small pieces of waste left behind at the table saw blade. For whatever reason, these ones kept catching on the blade and getting flung across the shop. But turning off the table saw each time so I could safely clear the waste was going to suck up a lot of time. I remembered a trick that I saw on a YouTube channel called Newton Makes, where he uses a pencil eraser to safely clear small waste pieces from the table saw blade, and this made the process much faster. If you ever do this, though, I would recommend using a wooden pencil instead of a mechanical pencil, though, because the eraser doesn't move when you apply pressure. I stuck with the mechanical pencil because it's easier to slide in my ponytail for storage when I'm not using it. Okay, so that really didn't take that long to mill all this up and cut them to length. But this is where I always feel like I run into problems with smaller items, and that's all of the little sanding and finishing that you have to do on this. I don't know if you can see, but there's all the tear out and stuff like this. And as a woodworker, my worst fear is that something I make breaks. And then my second worst fear is that something I make gives someone a splinter. So we need to take care of that. I was trying to think of a fast way to do this. And I was thinking of either just having a flat board like this and hand sanding, but this feels like it's going to take forever. And then the other thing is I want to preserve that they're like even thickness. I also need to get these edges. Okay, so what I'm thinking, even though it's going to take forever, is I think I'm going to set a chamfer bit in my router table, and I'm going to route all of the edges. And then I think I'm going to try using this sandpaper backed board to hold these still while I use my orbital sander to sand these. There's a saying in woodworking that goes, if the workpiece is large, take the tool to the workpiece. If the workpiece is small, take the workpiece to the tool. And so on projects like this, you have to figure out a safe way to work all these small parts. Often that even means foregoing power tools altogether and doing everything by hand. But after testing it out, I felt comfortable routing these pieces on my router table. I was removing a minuscule amount, just enough to ease the edge and get rid of any tear out. But honestly, the Purple Heart block still made me nervous. The end grain on Purple Heart really likes to grab the router bit. But overall, I felt like this was pretty safe. And then on the narrow passes, I did use my gripper to hold the piece. Ideally, you would also figure out a way to work multiple pieces at the same time. And I tried a few different things, but ultimately I couldn't find anything that seemed faster than just doing them one at a time. So I stood there and I routed each block for what seemed like forever. It felt as though like day passed into night and then back into day again, and my shoulders and neck hurt from like looking down at the exact same direction for so long. And I think I had extra tension in my neck because, if I'm being honest with you and myself, I knew this was kind of sketchy to do. So I had a really tense grip on those little blocks to keep them from flying across the yard. So once that tedious task was finished, it was on to the next, and it was time to sand. I grabbed my sandpaper backed board and clamped it down to my workbench with 2 guides to keep the blocks in place while I sanded. I just loaded as many blocks as I could fit at a time, hit them with the orbital sander, rotated them clockwise, sanded that side, and just continued in this manner until everything was finished. This part actually went faster than I anticipated, and it worked pretty well. If I was doing it again, though, I don't think I'd use the sandpaper side of the board because on some of the pieces, I accidentally scratched the surface while rotating them. Okay, so I have finished cutting, routing, and sanding all of these tiny little blocks. I was in routing purgatory yesterday, but we finished. So now I'm thinking about the container. And last night I was just curious, and so I happened to look it up, and you can buy the original version of this game for $5 on Amazon right now. And I will say, I really have to give it to like globalization because in my mind, I'm sitting here and thinking of all the ways, like how it is, even if you stole the wood and used slave labor, how you can get this thing produced and around the globe for $5, but like they did it somehow. And so with that being said, obviously I'm not competing on price here. I cannot sell this for $5 and make a living. So I'm going to lean into the like artistic thing a little bit. And with that being said, there were a couple of problems with the original game that I remember when I was a kid. And the first one is the plastic reloading sleeve was very flimsy and it cracked and broke. And then secondly, once the cardboard box got broken, you had no good way of storing this game. And so then it was like in a Ziploc bag or something. So I am looking to how can I solve those problems and how can I do something that's more beautiful. And so I'm thinking obviously a wooden box. And the key aspects of this box is like it needs to be pretty and it also needs to come apart in a way that one side of it can serve as the stacking device. So I think what I'm going to do is make the box into two pieces with three sides each. So like two sides and a top and two sides and a bottom. And that the side with the top is going to slide into this. Is probably not making sense, but hopefully it will. Slide into this to close, and then you can take it apart to use half of it for reloading. So my thought is on these boxes, I'm going to do maybe through dowels. Those are strong and they're fast and they are decorative. And then I have all of this leftover stuff from like shiplapping the backs of pieces. So I think I can like do some boxes out of this. I don't know. So that's where we're going. So let me reference again the first part of profiting on smaller pieces, planning. When I started this project, I didn't even consider the container, only the blocks. And because I didn't think this project through to the end, I had to go searching through my scrap pile yet again and reset my planner yet again. If I had thought about this at the beginning, I could have pulled all of this material and planed it at the same time as the other material, and this probably would have saved me at least a half hour. I'm ready to start figuring out my box, and the more I thought about it, I'm not going to put a top on, just because I think that that's just going to make it more difficult to get the puzzle out when you're ready to like play it. What I'm thinking is I'm going to do something like this for the main part of the box. And then I want to do dados on these two and then create the second half of the box that's going to slide in here. It's kind of hard to do because, okay, I'll do it with one side, but like that. Where possible to save time, instead of laying out and transferring measurements, I just use the object itself to measure. So, for example, I use the tower to measure the size of the walls for all the boxes. Each wall of the box was a different size, so I made sure to cut the same wall on all the boxes at the same time before adjusting to cut the next wall. I also used the workpiece to shift things around as needed instead of transferring measurements. This probably led me to do a couple of like borderline sketchy cuts on the table saw, but it honestly seemed pretty safe while I was doing it. When it came time to cut the dados, I did make some rough marks to ensure that I cut the right area of the box. For whatever reason, I always move the fence in the wrong direction and cut the dados on the wrong side of my cut line. And so I've started just making a rough layout mark to make sure I don't make this mistake. Also, when I cut dados, I always cut 2 test pieces with the rest of the batch. I use these to make fine adjustments before cutting my actual work pieces. And I do too, so that if I accidentally overcut the first one, I still have the second one to fall back on, making sure that I get a nice snug fit. Once I had the dados cut in the main part of the box, it was time to glue it together so I could get the final measurements for the sliding part of the box. I've found that another essential component of efficiency is jigs. Sometimes it's worth building a jig for a specific project, but others are universally useful. I made these corner clamping blocks a while ago and I love them. I glued up some scrap plywood I had laying around the shop to make them thicker, and this made them more stable, eliminating the need to hold them upright while I'm trying to clamp something at 90 degrees. They also have multiple flat surfaces so that I can get a clamp on at different heights, and then they also have a missing corner so that they don't accidentally get glued to my work pieces. I have found that these things have been worth their weight in gold around the shop. So on this project though, I glued together the dado side of the box. And then once I had those in clamps, I moved over and glued together the sliding part of the box. Once those dried, I took them to the table saw and cut them to height. I also cut out the bottom to size, but I forgot to film this part of the build. When I planned to do the through dowels on this project, I thought I'd be using some 1/8" poplar dowels I had laying around, but it turns out they aren't very consistent in thickness. Also, the walls of the boxes ended up being about a 1/4" thick, so drilling 1/8" holes into the sides was high risk for blowout. I was trying to brainstorm something to use when I noticed some toothpicks I had laying around. I usually use these to spread glue into small holes, but thought, like, why not just use these for my dowels? And so that's what I did. In case anyone's curious, you need a 5/64" pilot hole for Walmart toothpicks. I used some pliers just to snip the pointed parts off of the toothpick and then also to cut them in half. I also used the pliers to cut them flush to the surface before I sanded them down. I did have to support the toothpick as I hammered it in. It was quite delicate. Otherwise, I risked breaking it. Once I had all the holes plugged and once I had cut them as flush as possible with the pliers, I used a sanding block to clean off the bulk of the wood glue and then used my orbital sander to smooth everything out. Okay, so these are done, except for like finish sanding and cleanup and stuff like that. But I realized like this is very hard to get off. So I'm gonna drill like finger holes here and here to make it easier to lift off. I marked out the center of the box sides and used a four-snare bit to drill out a finger hole. I made sure to put a scrap board underneath to avoid tearing out the inside of the box. Then, with a little cleanup and finish sanding, I was ready for finish. And I haven't actually finished these yet. I haven't decided exactly what I want to do, but right now I'm leaning toward tung oil or something similar to that. I think this would be the most efficient and economical way to finish these and would still give like a nice feel since people will be touching them a lot. So overall, I spent somewhere between 8 and 10 hours making these 3 games. And I think if I had done a little bit of planning, I could have reduced that by a couple of hours, but I still don't think I'd be able to fetch the price I need to make this worth my while. But like all my woodworking projects, I at least learned a few lessons here.